I worked at a help desk as a database administrator, most recently as a site reliability engineer. And the biggest common pattern that I found is that I'm very lazy. I think a more attractive way to say that is I like to find ways to automate things and avoid doing manual work if I don't have to. So that's led me to a lot of scripting, which led me to playing with Nushell for the last 6 months or so, and that's what I'm talking about today. Before I get into that though, I want to quickly plug Present Term. I have nothing to do with Present Term, I just think it's a cool project. But this, especially if you're into terminal utilities, allows you to write slides in Markdown and then show them like this. So this is what a slide looks like. You have HTML comments to add pauses on your slides or end slides and move on to the next one. So check it out if that sounds cool to you. I'll quickly define what I mean when I say scripting, just to make sure we're all on the same page. We'll talk a little bit about the Unix philosophy and how it relates to Nushell, and then talk about some things Nushell does differently, and I'll kind of quickly cover a project that I rewrote for Bash to Nushell to show how they both look. So scripting is typically pretty short, a set of instructions that automates a manual process. So in other words, I'm not talking about writing an application with a lot of user interaction, a website API, something like that. This is quick and dirty, just trying to get something done so you don't have to do it yourself. And this relates to Nushell because some languages like Nushell are written specifically for scripting and not really intended to do that deeper, more complicated, or maybe performance stuff. So the Unix philosophy. I guess, can anyone here tell me what the Unix philosophy is? Like, quickly. Yeah, go ahead.
Do one thing well.
Yeah, one thing well. Yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up. There are kind of 3 parts that I want to note here. One is, like you said, do one thing and do it well. The others are write programs to work together. That's typically, especially in Unix, piping, or referred to as pipes and filters. And then handling text streams, because if everything speaks text, then it can all talk to the next thing and they can work together. So before we actually start talking about Nushell, I want to talk about if Nushell follows the Unix philosophy. I will say this is kind of a semantic thing that doesn't really matter unless you care about it, but I think it's worth noting and it helps you relate it to other things. So doing one thing and do it well, this is definitely one of the core philosophies of Nushell. The standard library provides a lot of tools that do one thing and not other things, to the point that like you have sort and sort by to do different forms of sorting, and it's not just a flag for the same thing. Piping and filtering is another core philosophy for Nushell. However, Nushell does not intend to strictly handle text streams. I have a bunch of slides on why I think this is maybe better than just handling text streams, so we'll get to that. But again, if this is important to you to follow the Unix philosophy, that is a negative for Nushell. Before we get to that, talking about those pipelines, pipelines are typically 3 parts. An input that gives you data, whether it's creating it or reading from a file or whatever. A filter that is changing that data in some way, and then an output that prints it out, writes it to a file, whatever. And those usually have that pipe character in between, that's why it's called pipes and filters. And so something like this, where we're listing out the files in our directory, identifying what are its directories instead of files, and cutting down that list a little bit, and then printing out the names. This is a very basic pipeline. One selling point, in my opinion, of Nushell is it's smart enough to tell when new lines aren't a separate command, so you can do things like this and split up the same command into multiple lines without backslashes to ignore the line breaks. And I think it's nicer, and you don't have to ignore all the characters on your screen. Nushell says, if you've looked at their page at all, that everything is data. If you're a fan of some languages like Lisp, it's not as exciting as it sounds, but it is cool. In Bash, you pretty much have numbers and strings. That's pretty much it. You kind of have a nothing. In Nushell, you also have booleans, lists, records, tables, as well as closures, which are like code blocks that you can pass around like their data. And one of the biggest benefits of this is that you get much more meaningful errors for why things are breaking. So I have a couple examples here, and I'll make this smaller for a minute. Where if we try to take a record in Nushell and pass it to the path type command, the parser tells us that path type doesn't support records. So we get some information on what's going wrong in our pipeline and directs us kind of to how we should fix it. Maybe that record has a path in the value and we forgot to get the value out of it before we sent it over here. And same thing with doing division on a string, that's not supported because those are two types that are incompatible. So you get some information on what's going wrong and how you should fix it. Since everything is data, you also get structured output from most of the standard library commands. So for example, looking at ls in bash and Nushell, and again, I'll make this a little bit smaller so you can see. Hopefully that's not too small. In bash, this is just a string with new lines separating the different file names, and it's all just one big string that you have to figure out how you parse. So it's always a string, you know how to accept that, but you also have to figure out what their meaning of a string is, something you want to speak. With Nushell, ls returns a table which has columns for the name, the type, size, and things like that. And so one of the benefits here is, for one, I think it's kind of easier to look at, but for two, you can query this information and get just the name column or get where the size is larger than a certain amount or whatever, and it's always exactly the same as any other data you're interacting with. And Nushell also has built-in support for most of the standard file types and data structures. So I have the same object here in JSON, YAML, and TOML. And if we use the Nushell open command, we get the exact same Nushell record out of this because it's the same data just formatted differently. And so we can get the same thing out of these files and then use Nushell exactly the same regardless of what language it's coming from. And I also have some examples at the bottom, and I apologize, I see that's kind of small. But we can also do things like convert TOML to YAML with just opening a TOML file and piping it to YAML. Very simple, you don't need any third-party tools for that. Or you can do things like, if you're using Kubernetes and kubectl, you probably get a lot of YAML out of things that you want to look at. And when it's a big, like 500-line YAML representation that's hard to look through, and you can pipe that to from YAML and then query out like the list of nodes or whatever, the same as you would query anything else with Nushell. Another thing that I at least do a lot in scripting is interacting with APIs, sending post or GET requests, and so I want to go through some examples of what that looks like in bash versus Nushell. So first off, in bash, I have a question. Show of hands for how you make an HTTP request with vanilla, plain, simple bash. Would you use curl or would you use wget? Okay, actually it's kind of a trick question. You don't. Curl and wget are both extra tools that you can install. And most Linux distributions or macOS would have one of those. And I have it installed for this example, but it's not something that you have just by default that you can do. And in this case, I also want to just get the columns for logins and contributions from the Nushell contributors. So we also have to install JQ so we can query the JSON representation we get back and get the logins and contributions. And you see we get a list here. Again, since it's supposed to be text, this is a string with new lines separating JSON objects with a login and a contribution. But it works, we got the information we wanted, and we could figure out what to do with it from there. Looking at this in Nushell, the standard library has an HTTP module that has subcommands for getting, posting, deleting, whatever. And so you can just say HTTP get and then the URL that you want to interact with, and that sends a GET request to it. And then since it can speak JSON and knows it's getting JSON back from this, I believe that's identified with the request type header that it gets. Then you can just pipe this to select and again interact with it the same as anything else. So we'll go ahead and run that. And we get the same information, but it also gets turned into a table, so this is opinions, but it looks a little bit nicer. And then you could go from here and again pipe to like where contributions contributions is greater than 500 and cut out all the smaller ones or whatever if you wanted to. It's all very standard and pretty easy to do. I'll quickly run through some other control flow things. This isn't intended to be like an advanced guide for Nushell by any means, but you have if statements, pretty simple. If a condition is true, do this, otherwise do this other thing. You also have match to check like a series of conditions. And then the pretty standard loop statements are loop to do something infinitely, for to go over like a range of numbers or the contents of a list, and while to do something while a condition is true. I have a note up here if you go through the slides and want to look at the documentation later. These are the like more familiar but less idiomatic ways to iterate over things. And the next slide we'll talk about it more, but Nushell has tended to be very functional, and so there are more functional ways to iterate over things that I think aren't familiar for most people, so I didn't put examples up here. Getting into that functional stuff, Nushell is kind of designed around the idea that most commands are expressions that only return one value. And like we saw with those errors before, they usually tell you what types they receive and return. And variables should be immutable most of the time. So you have to be very explicit when something might change partway through your pipeline so you know to keep an eye out for that. And so just an example of some like very light functional stuff in Bash and Nushell, where it's again pretty much just a pipeline. We're going to find all the log files in this project, find where the name is error or something, and then print out that file and content. And we get pretty much the same results from both. So now we'll jump into looking at some more complicated Bash and Nushell, and I'll just kind of skim over how they both look, and then if anyone has specific questions later, we can go through that. But the project that we'll be looking at is, I won't say unique, but I have a pretty specific workflow where most of my work happens in the terminal, if you can't tell from using a terminal slide deck. And I'm able to fuzzy find through directories that are usually Git repositories, create tmux sessions there, and then switch back and forth between those sessions pretty quickly. So first we'll look at the Bash version, and pretty simple. Simple is relative, I guess, but it checks that tmux is running, and if not, it creates a new session because a lot of this relies on tmux running, and then finds Git directories inside my home directory, removes the .git from the end because we don't want that, we want the actual project name, and then once we select one, down here it does some like cleaning of the name to make sure that it can actually turn into a session name, and then we will create a session if it doesn't already exist. I use NeoVim by the way, so it has a type page that's always NeoVim that I can switch to. And then we switch our client over to that new session. And I don't want to sound like I'm bashing Bash, but I don't find the syntax to be very clear when you're looking at Bash, and even having written a decent amount of Bash, there are things that I have to think about or like go look up when I come back to it. I still to this day can't remember what the difference is between two braces and one brace, but I know it matters and it breaks if I do the wrong thing. And again, like splitting new lines with backslashes just feels kind of awkward, and there are just parts of the syntax that at least don't work for me. Maybe that's a skill issue and you can make fun of me for that later if you want. So now I'll switch over to the Nushell version. Here's a sneak peek of what that sessionizer looks like. So this is Nushell, and this main function does most of what is mostly the replica of that Bash. So we find the Git directories, we get just the directory name from that path, and then this is what gives us that fuzzy finder that we wanted, and this does a little bit of cleaning up of that name, so we only have the last two parts of the path. So our selection will actually still be the full path, but when we're looking at it, it's a bit shorter and easier to look through. And this gives us a preview of the session, which the Bash version did not have. But we can show if there's already a session, we want a preview of what's currently open there, and if not, we'll list out the contents of the directory so we know what we're getting into. And session switch does most of the rest of the work. And if we go down to look at that, if there's not already a session, it creates it. And if there is a session, or once there is a session, it switches our client over to it. And this is the only check in this case that we have to make that Tmux is running, so it has some different logic for if it's not already running. Creating a session, pretty comparable. We create a session, add a NeoVim window because we want to make sure that's open. And then we have some other functions for previewing and seeing if a session exists, etc. And a couple other things that I want to point out is this also has some subcommands for directory to allow us to provide just like sessionizer, directory, and a path, and it skips the whole fuzzy finding thing. You can just switch over to that directory. Or sessionizer clone, we can give a git URL to, and it will clone that URL to like a standard path that it cleans up, and then switch over, create a session there, and send you over to it. So it's very quick for me to pull down a new Git repository and start working in it because of that functionality. And with that being said, I know this isn't really a fair comparison to the bash sessionizer because there's all this extra stuff that I wasn't doing in the bash. It's split out into different functions to make it easier to read, and there are these subcommands for like git cloning that just wasn't a part of it before. But I also think that's worth noting because, again, this might just be me being bad at bash, but when I've worked with bash, I've gotten to like the bare minimum of what I'm trying to do, and by that point I've experienced so much friction in working with bash that I'm kind of done with it and I just want to move on, and I don't go into all the extra refactoring to make sure it works really well, or adding extra stuff that I realize along the way, like this would be nice, but it doesn't technically have to happen. And with Nushell, I've enjoyed working with it enough that I want to put the extra time into doing that kind of thing. So again, I'll leave it at that, and if anyone wants to talk specifically about anything here, feel free to ask questions. So in summary, this is entirely my opinion, but Nushell has some great features that make scripting easier and faster. And I didn't really state it before now, but I hope it kind of came across that I think playing or experimenting with new tools is almost always worth it. Even if you end up throwing it away, I think that is almost guaranteed to teach you something new that you can apply to the things you do decide to use. Whether it's Nushell or whatever else, you're welcome to reach out to chat if you'd like. This QR code will take you to the GitLab repository that has this slide deck and some other code examples. And I have some links to the Nushell documentation with like their guides for going from Bash to Nushell or PowerShell to Nushell if you want to see what the comparison is. Do I have time for questions?
Yeah, go for it. I just came up with this whole cool QR code that usually means slides are
Yeah, Alex.
What slideshow program is this?
This is called Presenter. I think I have a link towards the beginning of the slides. Yeah, that'll take you to the repository.
So my question was going to be around like portability. So is there a time you find yourself reaching for bash instead if you know it's going to be on a different system, or I guess how far does your Nushell go, or is it just on your machine your scripts, or is it?
Yeah, it's a good question. Nushell does have support in containers, so you could run it for things like CI pipelines and GitHub Actions. I have still written some bash for things that I want to send other engineers that I know don't have Nushell installed. So there is a little bit there where like the benefit of bash is you know it's everywhere. And at least right now that's not the case. Maybe we can get Nushell there. But there have been sometimes I've reached for bash, and it's mostly to make sure I can share it with people that don't have the same preferences or haven't tried it out. I saw your hand first.
On slide 10, where you're like reading from YAML versus a couple different formats, and you're talking about being able to read all of these. Is that just based on the file type, or how's it know which file?
Yes. It assumes from the file type what the file format is. If If it's named some other thing, you always have the option of, like I have with the kubectl example, to pipe it to from YAML. And so that from command is kind of the way of, if Nushell can't assume what the type is, you can tell it what you want it to take it from. So I'll do that a lot for JSON files that aren't named JSON, and it's just like command output whatever, and then pipe it to from JSON, and now I have Nushell. Go ahead.
So CSH is case sensitive fuzzy pointer. How's the tab completion? How's the tab completion? Like you barely touched on it, but is it also case insensitive or is it case sensitive?
I think it's pretty comparable. My Nushell command line, if I can exit out of here, I have pretty good tab completion, but this is partially because I have both Atune and Carapace installed to do a lot of extra auto-completion stuff. So I don't have a great answer for how the standard Nushell completion is. I think it's good, but I used it for like the 5 minutes to get the other stuff.